Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this seminar, and thanks for the invitation to present. So my name is Michiel, and indeed, here in Leiden, we're based with a PRSM lab, where PRSM stands for Psychedelic, Religious, Spiritual, or Self-Transcendent and Mystical Experiences. And this is an acronym we've coined together with David Yaden from Johns Hopkins University, with whom we're currently working on a textbook on PRSM experiences and collecting all types of input from different scholars on this topic. This is me 16 years ago during my master thesis project, which I did at the Donders Institute in Nijmegen. So here I was working as a student, setting up my very first EEG study in the lab, where I did basic research on perception-action coupling. And the basic idea of the study that I started out with was, how does what we intend to do influence what we perceive? So we asked participants to grasp objects on this board or to point towards the object. And we investigated how visual information was being processed early on in the brain. The idea being that if you have to prepare a grasping action towards one of these objects, then the orientation information is more relevant compared to when you only have to point towards the objects. And that's exactly what we found. We found differences between grasping and pointing in early visual evoked potentials. But now you could argue, hey, that's a long way from basic perception action research to research on PRSM experiences. So what happened in between, and how did I end up investigating this kind of weird topic of PRSM experiences? And this fascination really goes back to my religious upbringing. I grew up in a church close to Amsterdam, which was an evangelical American-style Pentecostal church where people were having very ecstatic religious experiences. So there was exorcism taking place where demons were being cast out and people were became under the spell of the preacher. Faith healing was something that happened quite frequently. People were being prayed for and they would heal miraculously. Many people would be able to speak in tongues, which is basically the phenomenon where people utter a strange language that they don't understand themselves, and that is perceived to be a direct way of channeling a divine communication with God. And also a phenomenon that happened at the time was people were being slain in the spirit, which means they were being prayed for. They would fall down on the floor, lose their consciousness, and they would lay there for hours having a very ecstatic and intense experience of God. And as a teenager, I was growing up in this church. I was witnessing these events, and I was really wondering, what is going on here? Is it the devil in disguise? Is it God working? Or could it be that there's a psychological or neuroscientific explanation for the phenomena we're witnessing here? And basically, those experiences that I was witnessing as a teenager really are the driving force for much of my research, and have really been at the core of my fascination with neuroscience and psychology, for getting a better understanding of how it can be that some people have these very ecstatic and intense religious experiences, how these experiences come about, how we can explain individual susceptibility to these experiences, etc. So I was already intrigued by this topic at the time of my PhD research, which was very much focused on perception and action and understanding how that works in the brain and learning to use the tools of cognitive neuroscience. But after that, I decided to switch topics a bit and to focus on a phenomenon that I already found a bit more interesting, which was the phenomenon out-of-body experiences. So I signed up for a postdoctoral fellowship together with Professor Olaf Blanke, who was working at the time in Lausanne, and who was doing research on the neurology of out-of-body experiences. And he basically found, as you might know, that if you stimulate specific parts of the brain, the right temporal parietal junction, that people come to have this feeling that they perceive their body from an outside perspective. Somehow there seems an automatic timer behind my slides that I'm not aware of. That's why it keeps on skipping forward, but apologies for that. So he was doing research on how you can induce out-of-body experiences by brain stimulation, but also how you can induce these experiences in the lab by using fancy technologies such as vestibular stimulation in a rotating chair or using virtual reality. So we did research with this by manipulating people's awareness of their body, rotating them and investigating how, for instance, it affected their spatial perspective taking. We are also conducting research that was still more in line with my PhD topic, investigating perception-action coupling, but in this case, really focused on how it affects the body. And in this case, we were, for instance, collaborating with engineers from the robotics department, investigating if surgeons perform surgery from a distance, controlling a robotic device that can perform the surgery with high precision. If somehow the surgeon can get a feeling of control, can get a feeling of ownership over the robot that he's controlling by, for instance, adding vibrators. So under specific conditions, the body, the human body, can be extended by external tools and by haptic devices, and can give us an extended sense of body perception. So that was already a bit closer to the topic that I was interested in, but then I got the chance to really write my first own grant proposal. And that was very much focused on the question, where does religion come from? How can it be that some people are religious? And how did religion originate in the first place in our remote ancestors? And in order to address this topic, I looked into evolutionary psychology. And if you look in the literature, there had been some suggestions regarding the evolutionary basis of why people are religious. And one very prominent idea out there in the literature was that people have a hyperactive agency detection device, which is basically an innate device that is continuously hair-triggered to detect agency in the environment. So based on the principle that it is better to be safe than sorry, we are continuously equipped with the feeling that there's someone else out there. And these false positive agent experiences, the feeling that, hey, there might be a predator, hey, there might be another human there hiding in the bushes, could be at the basis of belief in ancestor spirits, belief in demons, supernatural beliefs, etc. So this is the basic intuition, that we continuously have agency experiences, and that these agency experiences are a driving force for people adopting supernatural beliefs. But this was only a theoretical idea at the time. So we set out an empirical research program to really put the ideas of this hypothesis to the test. And this has resulted in a research line on agency detection. First off, using an individual difference approach. So we did research with people who believed in paranormal phenomena. So we went, for instance, to psychic fairs that are organized in the suburbs in the Netherlands and are visited by people who strongly believe in paranormal stuff, but also by people who are only moderately interested. And here we looked at whether people who believe more strongly in supernatural phenomena also had a higher propensity for agency detection, for instance, by using a biological motion detection task, in which they had to say whether a human agent was present or not, by using an auditory agency detection task, etc. So we found indeed the expected correlations between supernatural beliefs and agency detection. Okay, so by using an individual difference approach, we indeed found evidence that the more people believe in supernatural phenomena, the more they have a tendency for illusory agent detection. So using basic signal detection tasks, they have basically a stronger response bias for saying, yes, there was an agent present, whereas in fact, there was no agent present. However, of course, correlation is not causation. So in order to really establish that there's a correlation between threat and agency detection and also supernatural beliefs in agency detection, you need more causal evidence, which is what we try to do in a couple of other experimental lines. So here's an overview of 6 studies we did in which we try to give people an anxious feeling by using different threat manipulations, using pictures, using threatening sounds, using virtual reality, and again, using all types of agency detection paradigms to see if threat priming increases agency detection. However, in none of these studies, we actually found evidence that threat indeed increases agency detection. Only in one study in which we used virtual reality, we presented participants with virtual forests that were either neutral or a bit ambiguous, like we increased the visibility of the display, and we instructed participants to press the button whenever they had the feeling that there might be another agent present in the virtual scenario. And only in this case, we found that indeed, if the forest appears more ambiguous, that people have a bias to more often press the button. But no correlation whatsoever with supernatural beliefs at an individual difference level. Also, if we try to prime people with supernatural belief concepts by using, for instance, semantic primes, referring to God, demon, angel, etc. So we presented words on screen reminding people of supernatural agents. with the idea being that if people are being primed with the supernatural agent, that this might result in an increased bias for agency detection. In none of these studies, we actually found causal evidence that if you make people aware of a supernatural agent, that they also have an increased tendency for falsely inferring the presence of a human agent. If we prime people with human primes, obviously, they have an increased tendency for detecting human prime or human agents in the biological motion perception test. So that's a proof of concept that the paradigm works, but there was no evidence whatsoever that supernatural or religious priming had an effect on agency detection. So this was at a point in time where I had never seen so many null results in my life. I came from my neuroscience background. I did research on Stroop tasks, flanker tasks, etc., where you always got your expected effects. But here again and again, whatever we tried in terms of manipulating threat, in terms of manipulating religious priming, there was no effect on our dependent measures. But at the same time, in the literature, there came a meta-analysis out showing that if you meta-analyze all the data using this type of religious priming, that there is actually a very strong effect of religious priming on, for instance, pro-social behavior, on people's tendency to cooperate with others, etc. So overall, the conclusion from that meta-analysis was religious priming can be used as an effective tool in social psychology to investigate the effects of religion on behavior. However, when we had a closer look of the data that was actually used in this meta-analysis using exactly the same manipulations that we were unsuccessful with, we found that if you analyze the data in a slightly different way, the same data but a slightly different meta-analytic technique, that you can actually find that there's no evidence at all for religious priming. So really depending on the meta-analytic technique that you choose, you can either show there's very strong evidence for an effect or complete absence for an effect. So in this paper, we actually made the more skeptical case that if you want to know that if a manipulation is effective, meta-analysis are never going to provide the convincing evidence because it really depends on how you set up the meta-analysis and what type of meta-analytic technique you choose. And the only way forward to show if an effect is real or is not real is to do a registered replication, where you set out to do a replication study on a larger scale, you pre-register everything, and then you see to what extent the hypothesized effect holds up. So this was really the starting point for what we have dubbed the religious replication project. And today I will go only shortly over some of the main findings of this project. And at the end, I will come back to some of the lessons learned throughout all of these different projects that we did to better understand PRSM beliefs and experiences. So in the religious replication project, we set out to replicate to what extent neuroscientific findings on religiosity could be replicated, dualism, findings about dualism as an innate bias, source credibility effects, and the relationship between religion and mental health. So first off, the neuroscience of religiosity. In the literature, there had been some suggestions about the neural basis of being religious. And specifically, it had been suggested that people who are more religious have a reduced tendency for conflict monitoring. The idea being that they less critically accept information. They're more open to potentially conflicting evidence. And this was based on findings showing that highly religious people have a reduced Stroop response. However, those studies were based on studies with relatively small sample sizes, with 20 to 30 participants. So we set out to replicate this finding in a high-powered study with 200 participants by using a Stroop task. And you can see that the response conflict and the effect of informational conflict. So response conflict is if you press the wrong button in a Stroop task. Informational conflict is if you have an incongruent compared to a congruent stimulus on screen, that this strongly activates the attentional control network. However, if you look at the correlation between relation between the bold signal and religiosity, you can see that the hypothesized relation did not hold up. So there was no relation whatsoever between being religious and being sensitive to conflict monitoring. So that finding that was out there in the literature could not be replicated. However, another finding was that many different brain areas, specific increases or decreases in brain volume, were associated with being more religious and also being more open to having mystical type experiences. For instance, by using patient studies, using voxel-based morphometry studies. But again, the existing findings were mainly based on relatively small sample studies. So we set out to replicate those findings as well by focusing on 3 brain regions that had been implicated in religiosity and mystical experiences: the OFC, the IPL, and the hippocampus. And here you can clearly see there was no effect of religious belief on any gray matter volume at all, and also there was no effect of mystical experience on any gray matter volume. So also those hypothesized relationship did not hold up, simply pointing out that such a high-level construct as mystical experiences or religious beliefs is not to be found in terms of an increased volume of gray matter in specific brain regions. That is too naive and too simple, so to say. And also to detect those relationships, you probably need not tens, not hundreds, but probably thousands of participants, because those relationships are really tiny. So not so promising results for the replication of neuroscience findings in relation to religious beliefs and experiences. But we also were focused on replicating other findings. And one finding that we found really intriguing was a finding that had been implicated in the literature, that we have an almost innate tendency to reason about the body and the mind as 2 separate entities. This is called dualistic reasoning, in line with Descartes' dualism, of course. And in the literature, there was a debate whether dualism is indeed intuitive and comes natural to children, or whether cultural learning is involved. So in this study, we set out to determine to what extent is dualistic reasoning cross-cultural, and to what extent is it cross-culturally generalizable? Can we observe this tendency in different cultures? So in order to test this, we set up a large-scale cross-cultural study consisting of 4 different sub-projects. So we collected data across 24 different countries from different continents and different religious and cultural backgrounds, with a minimum sample size of 400 participants per country. And the total sample size for this project was about 10,000 participants who contributed to the data. And in order to measure dualistic thinking, we used the following vignette study that had also been used in the previous literature. It is a vignette in which a person is reading about a grandmother passing away. She was taken to a hospital where they tried to help her, but she was too old and they could not cure her. The doctor or priest came to talk to Bill about what had happened to his grandmother. He said to Bill, "Your grandmother was very ill. There was nothing the doctors could do. Your grandmother is dead now, or your grandmother is with God now." You can see there are 2 different versions of the vignette. One is emphasizing the dead, and the other is emphasizing the religious context. So it's talking about a priest and talking about God. And then the story goes on. Now that she is dead with God now, do you think that Bill's grandmother can still be hungry? And then the participant simply has to say yes or no. Still wants to talk to Bill, still loves Bill, can still hear Bill's voice. And here you can see that some of the questions are about physical states and some of the questions are about mental states. And the idea being that the more people answer mental states with yes, the more they are, and the more they answer physical states with no, the higher the tendency for dualistic thinking. So people apparently have the intuitive tendency to think that indeed, when we die, our physical states discontinue, but our mental states still continue to exist in some form or another. And here you can see the pattern across the different countries. 24 countries were included, and in each graph, the red lines represent the continuation judgments for mental states, and the bluish, greenish lines represent continuity judgments for physical states. So you can see that across the board, across all countries, indeed, people have a higher tendency for making continuity judgments for mental compared to physical states. So that's a very strong cross-culturally prevalent finding. So statistically speaking, the pattern is comparable across all 24 countries. What you can also see on the x-axis is the individual religiosity of the participant. And you can also see that the tendency for dualistic thinking increases with increased religiosity. So highly religious participants even more strongly distinguish between mental and physical states than people who score low on religiosity. But you can even see that people who score low on religiosity, the atheists also still continue to think that mental states continue to exist. And then the third finding is the dark lines represent the religious framing condition and the light lines represent the secular framing. There's also a main effect of the framing. So if the religious context is emphasized, people make more continuity judgments overall. So this is actually very much in line with this idea that indeed our tendency for dualistic thinking is a cross-culturally stable pattern, and that this finding holds up and can be replicated cross-culturally. So that was more promising use for replicability within the field of religion and spirituality. A third finding that we set out to replicate using a very similar approach as in the previous paradigm was the effect of source credibility, which refers to the heuristic that typically we are inclined to trust those who are successful or those with whom we credit high credibility in the first place. So Dan Sperber talks about the guru effect, that people who are a guru are expected to talk an ambiguous language, and that their ambiguous language only adds to their status because they're expected to say things that are difficult to comprehend. So in order to test this, we used a very simple and straightforward paradigm in which we used a new age bullshit generator to make seemingly profound statements, but that were completely incomprehensible to people, such as, for instance, we are being called to explore the cosmos itself as an interface between faith and empathy. We must learn how to lead authentic lives in the face of delusion. And then we manipulated the context of the statement by telling people that the statement originated from a spiritual authority or a scientific authority, and also by manipulating the background and the pictures. And then the question was, how credible do people deem the statements depending on the source, and does it interact with people's worldview? And this is really good news for us as scientists, because across the board, we found that people perceive statements originating from a scientist as more credible than statements originating from a spiritual guru. So the blue line is representing the statements from the scientist, the red line is statements from the guru. So you can see that across all countries, there's a main effect of the source from which the statement is originating. You can also see that there is an interaction with participant religiosity, which is again represented on the x-axis. So low religious participants on the left side, highly religious participants on the right side. People who are highly religious find both statements actually quite credible. People who are more atheist actually have more confidence in the statement originating from the scientist compared to the statement from the guru. And also this finding was consistent across all different countries and cultures. So also the effect of source credibility could be replicated quite well in a cross-cultural context. Then the final example that I would like to highlight, and the lesson that we learned from the cross-cultural replication project, was aimed at assessing the relation between being religious and mental and physical health. Because in the literature, which originated mostly from North America, it had been suggested that people who are religious typically thrive better in life. They are scoring better than the average person in terms of mental and physical well-being. However, again, most of that research originates from the US and Canada, which are highly religious countries. And it is unclear to what extent this relationship is stable and depends also on whether the country itself as a whole is highly religious or not. So in order to test this relationship cross-culturally, in association with the same two previous studies, we also collected data on religiosity and on mental and physical health. And we had two research questions. Are religious people indeed healthier? And does this affect on the perceived cultural norms within one society? So take, for instance, the Netherlands or Belgium, which are highly atheist countries, like one of the most atheist countries in Europe, where only a small group of people are still highly religious. In a country like this, being religious goes actually against the cultural norm to be secular, to be a non-believer, and therefore might actually be detrimental to your mental and physical health, because if you're religious, you continuously have to defend yourself why you believe in things that the majority of people in your society don't believe in. So here we were interested to see if the relationship between religion and mental health might depend on whether you're living in a highly religious country in which being religious might be advantageous for you, or in a secular country in which it might actually work against your mental and physical health. And in order to do so, we use a so-called many analyst approach. And this is an approach in which you basically outsource the data analysis to multi-analyst teams. So people can sign up for doing the analysis of the data. They can all use a pre-registration of how they're going to analyze the data. And if they want, for instance, to analyze the data using a simple correlation model, a regression model, a multi-level model, they can specify the outlier exclusion criteria in advance, etc. And then you can imagine that 120 different teams will all have their own individual way of actually testing the same hypothesis. And then the key question is, to what extent do the conclusions of all the different teams converge to the same conclusion? Or do they actually differ depending on the type of analysis they did? And this gives you more confidence in the outcomes of a specific study, because irrespective of the outcomes, you can say across all analysis, in at least, for instance, 80%, we find that this relationship holds up, which is indeed what we found, at least for the first research question. So we found that all analysis teams, irrespective of how they analyze the data, or almost all of them, found positive evidence in favor of the hypothesis that indeed religiosity is positively associated with mental health. And a majority of the research teams, approximately 70%, also found positive evidence for the second hypothesis, that this effect depends on the cultural norms within one's society. So only in religious countries, being religious is adaptive for your mental health. In secular countries, it is actually that the relationship is absent or even reversed. So this really illustrates that if you have data on which people might have different interpretations on how you actually should go about analyzing the data, a many analyst approach can really help to settle the debate and see to what extent the findings from different analysis teams converge to the same conclusion. So some conclusions from the religious replication project: neuroscience findings did not replicate well, but more promising findings for dualism, source credibility, and religion and mental health. However, thinking back about the examples that I started out with, like these very ecstatic experiences in the evangelical church that I grew up in, a key challenge that we face in this type of research is, well, of course, you can assess how people believe, what they believe, using online surveys, etc. But how can you do research on religious experiences, spiritual experiences in the lab in an ecologically valid way? How can you induce these experiences and actually capture what is going on when people are having these very ecstatic-like experiences? And I think this question is still really at the core of my interest, and I'm still in the search for finding the best tools to do so. We have found a couple of tools that can help us to get a deeper understanding of what is going on, which I will highlight a few only today. Using placebo-brain stimulation, focusing on feelings of awe, and by using psychedelic substances such as psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA. And I will shortly give a couple of examples of all these different tools to actually trigger religious and spiritual experiences in the lab. First of all, placebo-brain stimulation. So in a couple of studies, we used the so-called God helmet, which was developed by Michael Persinger to induce mystical type experiences in the lab. He used a helmet in which electrodes were implanted that were supposed to trigger people's temporal lobes to trigger mystical type experiences. However, it has been pointed out that because people knew their brain was being stimulated, they were going to have a mystical experience, they were sensory deprived, that these are ideal situations to exert placebo effects, according to the predictive processing framework. People have a strong expectation about what is going to happen, they're sensory deprived, and therefore the mere suggestion of brain stimulation might already suffice to have these experiences. So in order to see if we could actually use a placebo God helmet as a tool to induce mystical experiences in the lab, we set up a couple of studies using between subjects approaches, within subjects approaches, and also individual difference approaches, in which we used a placebo God helmet. We instructed participants that the helmet would stimulate their brain, but it was a complete fake stimulation. The helmet was never actually turned on. People were sitting with a helmet for about 30 minutes to 1 hour, and they had to press a button whenever they had a mystical type experience. And under these circumstances, people reported, of course, all types of different experiences, ranging from very mild changes in their bodily sensations, such as tingling hands, limbs feeling heavy, to more strong percepts like changes in auditory processing, hearing of voices, listening to music in a white noise that was presented, to even stronger experiences. The most frequently reported was the feeling of a presence, the feeling that someone else was being present in the experimental room, seeing of visions, having visual hallucinations, to complete encounters with other spiritual entities. And these effects were not only triggered by sensory deprivation alone, because, for instance, we also sensory deprived people in a condition in which the helmet was taken off, and there people still had some of these mild sensations, but not the strong effects that we see when people were thinking that they were sitting with the God helmet, with the placebo God helmet. Another consistent finding across all these studies is that some people are more prone to having these experiences to others, a finding I will come back to later on at the end of this presentation. Well, this is one way to induce mystical type experiences in the lab. Another way to induce these type of experiences is by giving people placebo psychedelics. So we have done research with real microdoses in which we gave people a small microdose of psilocybin. But in this study, we actually tried to see if we could, similar to the God helmet study, also induce an altered state of consciousness by giving people a placebo psychedelic. And we increased suggestibility by using a colorful room, which was equipped with all types of psychedelic paraphernalia. We also basically increased the suggestibility of participants by, in the placebo condition, slowly enhancing the saturation of the colors that were presented on screen to make it appear as if the perception of the participant was really changing. And also in this way, we could show that through placebo and through suggestion, you can actually induce a mild altered state of consciousness in participants through mere suggestibility. So these are interesting tools to play around with people's expectations and basically show the power of prior expectations on what people experience. So this is one line of research we've been exploiting over the past couple of years to see how you can study basically altered states in the lab. A second line of research is focused on feelings of awe. And the feeling of awe typically arises when people are presented with natural beauty, with vast scenes that are magnificent, with waterfalls, with scenery of mountains, etc. And feelings of awe have been characterized as a self-transcendent experience. And in previous research, we have found that if people feel in awe, for instance, when they're watching a video clip representing beautiful scenery of mountains, vistas, etc., that people literally feel small and insignificant, and they underestimate the size of their body. However, in those studies, people were typically presented first with a video, and then they had to do a subjective rating. But in an fMRI study, we were interested to see what are the neural correlates of feeling in awe. And in this study, we found that if people are watching awe videos and they are completely absorbed in the video, that the default mode network, so you can see here medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, that the default mode network was less active when people were feeling in awe compared to when they were watching positive and neutral videos, when people were completely immersed in the content of the video. This was not the case when people were watching with an analytical mindset. So when we asked participants to count how often the camera changes perspective, we did not find the differences between the different video conditions. So it's really when people feel in awe, the default mode network is less activated, probably reflecting reduced focus on the self, reduced self-referential processing, and reduced mind wandering when people are completely immersed in the attention-grabbing nature of awe-inducing videos. We also found that if people are on a microdose of psilocybin, that it also has a tendency to increase feelings of awe. So when people take psychedelics, this also enhances their capability for enhancing strong feelings of awe. And across all these different studies, again, one finding that pops up again and again and again is that individual differences in so-called absorption capture a proclivity for having mystical experiences with the God helmet, but also having stronger feelings of awe in response to all these different awe manipulations that we use using videos, but also using naturalistic field settings. And the absorption scale was developed in the 1970s as a measure to measure hypnosis proneness. And it contains items like, I can be greatly moved by eloquent or poetic language. Sometimes I can change noise into music by the way I listen to it. If I wish, I can imagine that my body is so heavy that I could not move it even if I wanted to. And across all studies, absorption seems to predict mystical experiences, feelings of awe and wonder, but also intensity of psychedelic experiences. Voice hearing experiences in Pentecostal Christians, like the examples I was referring to in the beginning. Yes.
Do you think you can manage in 5 minutes?
Sure, yeah, I'm reaching the end of the presentation. Yeah, I will wrap up soon. But also paranormal beliefs and encounters. And a key mechanism underlying absorption seems to be vividness of mental imagery. People who score high in absorption have a very vivid mental life. Reality monitoring, conflating what is real with what is imagined, and being open to experience. So I realized the format of this presentation is somewhat dissimilar than what you might have heard before, because I really took my personal journey, starting out in the Pentecostal church and starting out with very basic neuroscience research to find my own line of research that I'm really fascinated about, and ending up with research these days on psychedelic substances. But I hope that throughout all these different topics, including agency detection, the religious replication project, the research on awe, mystical experiences, and more recently the psychedelic research, a couple of important lessons can be learned. And that's why where I would like to conclude today as well. Some lessons learned through all these different projects. Well, one of the most important lessons for me is integrate open science practices wherever possible. So replicate findings, replicate existing findings, pre-register every study you do as far as possible. Try to engage in registered reports, collaborate in team science, collaborate by using many analyst approaches, multiverse approaches, in which you analyze the data in all possible ways that you could analyze it, and then you report it all instead of selecting only one analysis pipeline. In the cross-cultural replication project, we've also come to learn the value of large-scale cross-cultural studies, because you can get interesting insight in, for instance, the moderating role of socio-cultural factors that you lose out if you only do research within one country. And through all the research on the God helmet studies, also the power of placebo. Through placebo, you can also explain a wide variety of different effects that have been reported in the literature, including mystical type experiences with the God helmet. In terms of measurement, I'm really a big fan of so-called network approaches in psychopathology. So we've written a paper in which we basically apply a network approach to depression to explain the effects of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, basically arguing that the network becomes more loose. And this is a tool that can be easily implemented in JASP, which is freely available, but also in R. It is not that difficult to do, and it gives you a very rich representation of what is actually in your data, instead of only focusing on some scores, for instance. I hope that I've shown in the religious replication project that there are many cool tools from the psychology of religion and spirituality. There's a rich variety of different skills that have been developed and validated to measure subjective experiences. And also more recently, we've become really interested in the value of phenomenology, really getting in-depth insight in people's experiences by using in-depth interviews and conducting qualitative data analysis on those interviews. And in terms of theory, I think there are many cool tools that are also relevant for the research of consciousness research, such as the theory of hyperactive agency detection, dualism, or source credibility effects, predictive processing, and absorption that can all be used to inform how we can do research on altered states. And what is really my vision for the future is that we will do more research on all the different methods that can be used to induce different states of consciousness, including meditation, breathing exercises, holotropic breathing, sensory deprivation, and virtual reality. And to be honest, I think the best is yet to come, because there are many cool funding initiatives that I would like to highlight. One is the Open Science of Religion project, in which I'm involved myself as editor, where you can submit a proposal for a registered report study to get microfunds. A similar initiative has been launched for funding of consciousness research. If you're interested, have a look. You can apply for grants of up to $20,000 or $50,000 to conduct a registered report study with anything that has broadly to do with the topic of consciousness research. And last year, we started in Leiden the Putting Psychedelics in Perspective project, in which we basically set out to do exactly the same as with the religious replication project, replicating key findings in the literature on psychedelic research to see if we can actually replicate, for instance, the anthropic brain hypothesis. So if you're interested to learn more about this, please have a look at the lab website and you can subscribe if you want more info, because I hope that that will yield also similarly interesting data as we collected in the context of the other replication projects. That project is made possible by the PhD students Josie Marshall, Xaver Vonk, and Hussein Baykoyle, who recently started here in Leiden. Also thanks to all the other people who contributed a lot to the research that I presented today. And thanks once more for the invite. And I'm happy to answer questions and look forward to the discussion.